We begin today's show with news of Donald Trump. Of course, who else? We can't avoid Donald Trump in the news for, any amount of time. But this, on top of his legal issues in New York State and other venues, he is dealing with the fallout from Roe v. Wade and his claim that he personally is responsible for the end of Roe v. Wade by appointing three extremely corrupt Supreme Religious Court justices. Those justices, of course, voted in 2022 to throw Roe v. Wade out, leaving 22 states without any access to abortion, reasonable access to abortion. Florida's new ban is going into effect this week. Actually, it went into effect on the 1st of May, which is now a 6-week ban. Meaning, if you live in the state of Florida, the nearest place to get women's health care is Virginia. And even Bristol, Virginia, is a 17-hour drive from Central Florida. God help those living in the very southern part of Florida who have unwanted pregnancies or unviable pregnancies. There will be no help for you. Donald Trump is personally responsible for it, no matter how much he tries to moderate his position. Meanwhile, in a New York City courtroom, he continues to fall asleep. Yes, taking a little nap. His lawyers have attempted everything to keep the man in line, and instead, he has, fallen asleep and sharded himself while he's been asleep. This has been reported by everyone, including the both sidesist journalist Maggie Haberman, who will bend over backward to, attack Joe Biden because of his age. And even she's reporting that Donald Trump is, messing himself during court. And it's even repulsing his attorneys. We're now 10 days into the trial of Donald Trump. And something to consider. He had to sit and listen to the Cohen tapes. Yes, we've all heard the Cohen tapes, where the conspiracy was hatched to hide the money that was paid to Karen McDougal, and then the same scheme was later used to hide the payments to Stormy Daniels. All of this is a bit convoluted, and here's basically how it goes. Back when Melania Trump was pregnant with their only child, Barron Trump, by the way, Melania and all of his children, with the exception of Eric, on one occasion, have been present for trial in New York City, where they're just 20 minutes away, have not shown up to support their father, their God King, Dementia J. Now, Defendant J, as he sleeps his way through a criminal trial that could see him go to prison for, just 4 or 5 years, something like that. Trump is trying his best to run away from the Roe v. Wade decision and the fact he did appoint those judges. He did appoint those justices to the Supreme Court who ignored everything that they said to the United States Senate, that ignored precedent, ignored constitutional law, and overturned Roe v. Wade, throwing it to the states and throwing women's health care out the window. Something I've been considering lately. Since there is no board of ethics, there is nothing that governs the Supreme Court, we need to appoint a special counsel, and we need to appoint one now to look into all 6 of the conservative justices. You can throw the other 3 in there if you want to, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Ketanji Brown Jackson if you want. But this Supreme Court does need to be investigated. It needs to be investigated for its wrongdoing, for its miscarriage of justice time and time again. It has failed the American people. It's just that simple. Taking hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from people like Leonard Leo, and by the way, WNYC's On the Media radio program or podcast, available wherever you get your fine podcasts, just like this one, has done a deep dive into Leonard Leo and his attempt to remain obscure. Well, we all know about you now, Leonard. We also know about Harlan Crow, We also know about the nonsense, the pure bullshit that is Justice Clarence Thomas, who, well, frankly, is a racist against his own race, who has spent his career trying to tear down the very structures that allowed him to succeed. And I know he hates to hear that race played any role in him having such a prominent legal career and eventually landing on the Supreme Court. But facts are facts, and reality is reality. And that's something he just has to accept. And so do the rest of the justices. And if they have violated the law, they should be prosecuted by the Department of Justice. Doesn't mean they're kicked off the Supreme Court. It just means they are felons. And if they have any little tiny sliver maybe of, personal conscience, they would just resign, just step down and allow President Biden to fill their seat. By the way, the number one issue among voters, time and time again, poll after poll after poll, is inflation. Inflation is out of hand. Inflation is 100% President Biden's fault. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact corporations are using this opportunity to price gouge the hell out of the American people. Donald Trump is guaranteeing a 10% import tariff. A tariff on every single item imported into the United States at 10%. This would crater the U.S. economy. It would price out groceries for the average American family. It would price out everything that we're used to. A 10% tariff is going to lead to a 20, 30, 40% rise in cost at the grocery store, to have your car serviced, to buy an automobile. To get almost anything. The things on which we rely as a society will be essentially out of reach for the average American. A 10% tariff would collapse the United States and collapse the U.S. economy. Now, on to another nut job and wacko, RFK Jr. That's right, the man whose voice makes your ears bleed. In recent polls, voters on the Democratic side were somewhat receptive to the idea of RFK Jr., despite the fact the entire Kennedy family has come out in support of President Biden. That doesn't change the fact that he has the Kennedy name. However, when those voters were explained his position on bringing back certain diseases that have been eradicated from the United States thanks to vaccines, that he's an anti-vaxxing wacko, only 1 in 10 Democrats would even consider RFK Jr. However, when put to Republicans, 8 in 10 would consider RFK Jr. 8 in 10. They love anti-vaxxers. They love diseases, again, long eradicated from the United States. RFK Jr. has to be a target of the Biden administration, and they're doing a fairly good job of it. Not to mention they have plenty of cash on hand to go after both he and Donald J. Trump, defendant J. Trump, who is spending his days inside a freezing courtroom. By the way, MAGA world, Superman doesn't get hot. He doesn't get too cold. Neither does the Messiah. This is just further proof that he is neither one. He is a sexual predator. He is a man who claims he can grab women by the crotch. We'll leave that expletive out. At will, because he was a celebrity. Oh, he's famous, so he can do whatever he wants, including cheating on his pregnant wife with a Playboy model named Karen McDougal. Her attorney, Keith Ellison, was on the stand yesterday giving testimony. In fact, I believe it was over the last couple of days he's been giving testimony to the court, admitting to the payments, not to mention the receipts, the actual checks themselves, copies of them, written by Michael Cohen. After all, it was Cohen and Trump who hatched the entire plot to hide this from the American people. The relationship with he and Karen McDougal lasted 10 months, according to Miss McDougal, and it ended because he started having an affair with porn star Stephanie Clifford, also known as Stormy Daniels. That's sort of to line things up from you. So he was having an affair with a woman named Karen McDougal, cheating on his wife, then cheated on his mistress with yet another woman who he paid $135,000. He had Michael Cohen make those payments by taking out a line of credit against his New York City home, and then paid him back through 34 individual payments, hence the 34 criminal counts against him. But he's sitting in a freezing cold courtroom. Oh, somebody help him. Somebody help him. Because after all of that testimony from former friend David Pecker, I assume he's a former friend. I don't know if Trump would still consider him a buddy or not after openly admitting to the catch and kill scheme cooked up by he and Donald Trump. It is what it is. David Pecker got up and the head of AMI, publisher of the National Enquirer, admitted to buying up these negative stories and killing them, then promoting negative stories about Hillary Clinton. Because this isn't about 2020, this is about the 2016 election. Even the Supreme Court couldn't interfere on this one because he was nowhere near being president in 2015 when he came down the golden escalator, the cheesy, tacky, golden escalator at Trump Tower, which will be property of New York State soon enough if he can't come up with the $465 million, which he might actually be able to do once he's able to sell his stock in DJT, Trump Media, because it's the meme stock of all meme stocks, and these idiots are actually buying it. I mean, they're publishing on this website how to avoid short sellers. That is, retail investors and institutional investors who take out bonds to short the stock because they know as soon as Donald Trump can dump the 115 million shares of DJT or Trump Media that he owns, the stock will literally go to below $1 a share. Even though they've managed to pump the stock back up to like $48 a share as of this morning, it opened at 79. But even where it's at now, on paper, it makes Trump worth about $4 billion. And if you add up all of his real estate holdings, he's worth about $3 billion actual dollars. So, in theory, he could come up with the $465 million and pay the state of New York. He can certainly come up with the $94 million he owes E. Jean Carroll, the woman he sexually assaulted at Bergdorf Goodman in 1996, who won a judgment against him for defamation and sexual assault once and was awarded $5 million. And then a second time, he defamed her the very next day after that judgment was issued. He defamed her yet again. And what came of that? Well, a $92 million. I think the total amount was actually $83 million, but with interest, it's well over 90. We'll call it $100 million that he now owes E. Jean Carroll. And after the whole, once this goes through deliberations, he's still going to owe E. Jean Carroll $100 million. Even after this goes through the whole process of appeals in New York State, he will still owe New York State $465 million. Now, he did put forward the $175 million cash bond, but that's not going to save Trump either. Ultimately, he will have to pay that $465 million. Now, on to the politics of the day. If you want to avoid all of the nastiness promised by Donald Trump in the recent Time magazine article, he talks about arresting and putting in camps all 11 million people who are undocumented living in the United States, throwing their children out, even though they have birthright citizenship because they were born in the United States, ending that whole practice, and vetting every member of the federal government who has some disagreement with Trump or might stand in Trump's way because they won't pledge a vow to him. They'll only pledge a vow to the U.S. Constitution, keeping people like H.R. McMaster and John Kelly out of Donald Trump's way. Yeah, terrifying, right? Then there'll also be camps for those anti-Trumpers like me. Now, I'll be way down the list because, frankly, we're a very, very small podcast trying to get our feed, trying to get listeners, trying to get people to pay attention, especially in our region. We focus on East Tennessee, on Kentucky, on North Carolina, a state that is very flippable, a state where President Biden is spending a lot of money because it's about time for North Carolina to flip. It's getting there. More and more people moving into North Carolina. And just like Georgia, it's right on the cusp of flipping. Now, I believe in 2026, when the next senatorial elections happen in the state of North Carolina, it will be an easy one for us to pick off, as will be Maine. Now, as for this election, we have to pick up a seat in one of two red states, either Texas or Florida. In Florida, we have an excellent candidate who could get rid of Skeletor, the nightmare himself, former Governor Rick Scott, by electing Debbie Powell. Debbie Powell would be an excellent U.S. Senator, would help end the filibuster, would help end the Electoral College, which is really just a Jim Crow era concept to limit the voting power of African Americans in this country. And we have Colin Allred, former Dallas Cowboy in the state of Texas, running against the least popular senator in the United States Senate, Ted Cancun Cruz. You know, the guy who ran off to Cancun when it got too cold in Texas. Oh, poor Ted was cold. Had to go to Cancun. Had to get away. We have that opportunity, but it's going to take mass turnout, and it's going to take a focused effort, door knockers, people getting out and doing what has to be done to make sure we have a Democratic Senate for the first 2 years of the second Biden term. And also just getting out to vote for President Biden. If we don't, we see what's coming down the lane. We see what Donald Trump is telling us. Believe him when he tells us he's going to essentially destroy the United States and democracy as we know it, leave Congress and the Senate without any power whatsoever. And all of that will be just fine with the MAGA folks, right? The MAGA folks will be just fine with never being able to vote again, especially when Donald Trump continues to desecrate their holy book, the Bible. They've already got their Supreme Religious Court, which has to be expanded, has to be fixed, so that the President of the United States can go about doing his business. The fact they're even hearing this stupid case of absolute presidential immunity is proof that they're there just to help Trump delay. Because Trump wins by delay. That's why Justice Merchan, and they call them justices in New York, Judge Merchan, in the Superior Court in New York City, isn't having it. He isn't having the delays. Trump is already complaining that the trial is moving way too fast. It's happening way too fast. No, Donald, it's happening at regular speed. It's happening the way it's supposed to, my friend. That's all there is to it. It's just that simple. So, if you live in Florida, if you live in Texas, come on, vote for democracy. Vote for Colin Allred. Vote for Debbie Powell. These people will be excellent senators, and I apologize for the background noise. Here at the offices, they're doing some landscaping, but we're going to go ahead with the podcast anyway. We're pretty sure that Democrats will flip the House. Well, we know they will flip the House, and there are 2 Senate seats that we absolutely must hold on to despite the fact they're in red states. Both Jon Tester of Montana and Sherrod Brown of Ohio have proven that they can win on split tickets. We have to make sure it stays that way, that even those inclined to vote for Donald Trump or to vote for a third-party candidate will vote for Sherrod Brown and Jon Tester. We must keep them in the United States Senate. We need those votes. Those votes are the difference in being able to put justices or judges on courts. They're the difference in being able to kill the filibuster, especially now that Joe Manchin's gone. So now we're going to be down to a 50-49 Senate because he's essentially conceding his seat to his good buddy, the Republican governor of the state of West Virginia. West Virginia. Yeah, exactly. What do I have to say? I mean, Virginia's fortunate that they don't have to deal with the residents of that state. And something that we don't really talk about that often here on the Magnolia Media Network are the protests that are happening on college campuses like UCLA and Columbia. Why? Because in a recent Marist poll, when interviewing a group of 18 to 29-year-olds, the Gaza, or rather Hamas-Israeli conflict, came in at 2%. 2%. That's where it ranks among things that concern people of that demographic, young people. 2%. However, 80% of the United States supports our support for Israel. So when President Biden comes out and says what he had to say about the campus protests and that everyone has the right to protest, just don't go smashing windows, don't go being violent because all you're doing is setting us back. That's all that's happening. You're setting back your own cause. And while I don't believe in genocide, the thing to remember is that Hamas is the party stopping the ceasefire. The United States is currently building a bridge, a floating bridge at this moment. That's why Secretary of State Antony Blinken is essentially on a red eye back and forth to the Middle East and D.C. on what seems like every other day, because we're trying to get aid in as quickly as possible. Hamas is standing in the way. Hamas decided back on October 7th to attack Israel, knowing what type of military capability Israel has. They're the ones who fired 2,000 rockets to try to break through what's known as the Iron Dome, and some did. They killed 1,250 plus Israelis and took another 200 plus hostage. And while the Bibi Netanyahu government absolutely has to go, it's corrupt beyond comprehension. The war has to be finished first. And Hamas cannot be allowed to continue to control the area known as Gaza. Even though Palestinian support for Gaza has gone up, it's very easy to get lost in all of this. Hamas is using the Palestinians as human shields. Hence, 34,000 dead. Do I think it's a good idea to invade Rafah? No, I don't. I think a tip of the spear approach would have been a lot better, especially considering the abilities and capabilities of Israeli special forces, much like the Navy SEALs here in the United States. So one of the reasons I've stayed away from it is because I believe in the ability to protest, but I don't believe in intimidating Jewish students or Jewish students intimidating Palestinian students. or Arab students. But when you see people holding up signs, pointing them toward Jewish students saying, Hamas is coming for you next, or from the river to the sea, which is essentially genocide for the Israeli people, which is the real goal of Hamas, which is backed by Iran. So is Hezbollah, just to the north, in Lebanon. And of course, the rebels in Yemen, who are doing what they can to assault Israel. Israel is still under attack today. And that's by embedded forces inside Gaza, by Hezbollah in Lebanon, which for all reports indicate that Hezbollah, or rather Lebanon, is on fire and on the verge of another civil war. A country that had seen some peace, but Iran has to stick its dirty fingers into other countries' business, stoke violence, stoke fear, and cause chaos. It's something that has to stop. And the United States and Israel have the ability to stop it. Yes, there need to be new elections. We need rid of Bibi Netanyahu, the most corrupt prime minister possibly ever in the 76-year history now, of the Israeli state. From the river to the sea, if those type of things are being promoted by lecturers or professors, non-tenured professors at these universities, they should return to work only to find that they have been fired the very next day. And complaining about being arrested at a protest means you're not really a committed protester, because getting arrested comes with the territory. I mean, truly liberal protests, those protesters know they're going to be arrested. And any comparison to 1968 is absurd, especially when we're talking about something like 1,000 young people total. 1,000. There are protests going on at every major campus in the United States. They're 99% peaceful. And they understand that under a Trump administration, Gaza would be an effing parking lot for Israeli cars. Nothing would be left alive in Gaza if Donald Trump were president. He would promote Bibi Netanyahu, promote lethal force across the board, and essentially wipe out all, Palestinians in Gaza, and allow the Israelis to do whatever the hell they want. It's one thing to be pro-Palestinian and to want to see the death and depravity stop, to see medicine and food get in, but Hamas is going to hinder that effort. So just remember, one day, you 19 to 22-year-olds will be adults, and you'll look back on this. And if it's not you who looks back on this, it'll be your children and grandchildren. And just like those who stood in the way of African American students segregating universities in places like Alabama, there will be a sense of shame. Because the reality is, Hamas caused all of this. Now, the indiscriminate bombing, some of the reaction, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, is simply unacceptable. But at the end of the day, Hamas has stopped peace from happening in the region time and time again since they took control of the Gaza Strip more than 15 years ago. So, a big difference between faculty and students and how they should approach these protests. But again, we're not going to spend all day, a whole lot of time, covering what are largely peaceful protests, well-intended protests. We're going to support the Jewish people. We're going to support Arab and Palestinian Americans because they are Americans. We're going to continue to ridicule and criticize Bibi Netanyahu's government because he hasn't been able to secure the release of Israeli hostages. By the way, many of them are American citizens who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. When it took 6 hours for the IDF, an extremely effective military, to respond to a terrorist attack that was happening in southern Israel. 6 hours. 6 hours of Hamas going door to door, murdering old folks, killing babies, killing young people at concerts. We cannot explain away or excuse away their behavior. We can't excuse away some of the behavior of the IDF. And we certainly can't excuse away university students holding up signs telling Jewish students to, quote, go back to Poland. Do I really need to remind you of what happened to the Jewish people in Poland? That's where Auschwitz was located. That's where the majority of the 6 million Jews who were rounded up and killed by the Nazis occurred. Back to Poland, huh? I mean, it's getting to a point, especially at UCLA, where the police had to step in and did exactly what they were supposed to do. It was an illegal settlement. Those tents, those barricades had to be torn down, and those students who wouldn't leave had to be arrested. It's the right thing. And far be it from me to agree with the LAPD or any police department for that matter, but this was the right thing. I don't know if they came on their own fruition or if the university called them in. Either way, it was the right thing to do. And again, being arrested when you're protesting is just part of it. It's part of being a protester. The hope is to get arrested and draw attention to something that you feel needs attention. Am I right? I'm going to speed things along here. Also, back in the House of Representatives, the 118th Congress, which has been the worst Congress in U.S. history. Look at charts anywhere. They've gotten almost nothing done. By the way, those of you who voted for them because you wanted inflation brought down, they spent 16 months investigating President Biden, and they've come up with exactly nothing. Nothing. What kind of man is that squeaky clean? What kind of man can be investigated that much, that deeply, and find nothing? Jimmy Comer, he's even looking for an off-ramp. He's leaving Congress to go run for governor of Kentucky, which he'll probably lose again, as a Democrat is currently governor of Kentucky. We can win these states. Governor of North Carolina, Democrat. Hell, even the governor of Louisiana was a Democrat. I'm not sure if John Bel Edwards is still in office or not. We've got 2 Democratic senators from the state of Georgia. We can do it. Virginia wants a bastion of conservatism, as liberal a state as there is anywhere in the country, or at least as liberal as states like Colorado and New Mexico. With the exception of one off-year election when Glenn Youngkin managed to sneak into the governor's mansion. He knows his days are numbered. There'll be an off-year election next year, and, well, he's done. After Democrats took back the House, swept in and took control of the House and the Virginia State Senate, Youngkin's days are all but numbered. He's done. It's just that simple. Youngkin is not going to survive it. And that's okay. I mean, things happen. Larry Hogan was, governor of Maryland, the most Democratic state in the country. But he was a moderate. He was somewhat acceptable. He's running for Senate there now. Nobody believes he's actually going to win. He's just wasting a whole bunch of RNC money. Ultimately, when it comes to Senate seats and things of that nature, it's a whole lot different than running for governor. And Larry Hogan, who is wasting a lot of RNC money they do not have, because Laura Trump is now in control of the RNC, and all of that money is going to Big Daddy. Big Daddy, take a dump in my underwear, Trump. That's right. Diaper J. Trump is soaking up every penny. Hell, in Michigan, the Michigan RNC, or rather the Michigan Republican Party, has had to take out lines of credit. While Biden is breaking fundraising records. He's raising more money than Barack Obama. But somehow this is a tied race. Doesn't that make you question the polls just a little bit? When they show it neck and neck, neck and neck, neck and neck. Because what do the polls have to gain from showing Biden has a 7 or 8 or 9 point lead? What do the pollsters have to gain? After all, polling works like this. An organization, a company like ABC News, CBS News, CNN, Harvard will partner up with a polling organization and say, we want you to poll X number of registered voters or likely voters. They'll say, we want a poll done to show us the current state of the presidential race. And it's $50,000 to $100,000 depending on the size and the specificity of the poll and the polling company. There is a polling industrial complex in the United States. I mean, just ask the French. They have polling on everything. There's a new poll every 24 hours in France. So the larger question becomes, what exactly do we do with this information? Should we take it as gospel? I mean, they were only off by 13 points in Wisconsin's Chief Justice Supreme Court race. Yeah, they were only off by 13 points. They were off by 3.5 percentage points in the last election when they had Biden up by 7 on election day, and he ends up winning by 3.5. If the polls are off by 3.5 this time, that means Biden leads in all the swing states. He leads in the national polls by a healthy margin. Even when you add now disgraced Harvard professor Cornel West, who we'll talk about in a moment, let's put a pin in that, and RFK, I prefer disease Jr. But back to Cornel West for a moment. In my opinion, Cornel West hasn't just ruined his own personal image. He's also ruined the reputation of a long-respected, very liberal newscast called Democracy Now!, where he was often brought on to give his opinion on world events. Brother West, as he likes to call everyone else, brother whatever, this is Brother Ruggiero telling you you're a dark horse who is being supported by Donald Trump. Donald Trump's early voting committee is out trying to make sure you get on all 50 state ballots. And you say he's a fascist and you're going to beat him and you're going to become president of the United States, but you're polling at like 1%. They're hoping that 1% is just enough for Trump to squeak out a win in key swing states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Frankly, sir, you are an asshole. And we know that this has something to do with a massive amount of money that you owe in taxes. Meanwhile, once again, Trump was held in contempt in the New York City election interference trial. It's not a hush money trial. I wish that the legacy media would stop calling it that, but then again, the legacy media is run by corporate overlords who want things done a certain way and said a certain way. They want both sidesism because embedded in those corporate boards that run legacy media are people who have twisted political views, who believe that a Trump presidency would just be grand for them. To hell with the fact he's going to march their anchors who are viewed as liberal, even if they're registered Republicans, into internment camps. That doesn't seem to strike a chord with any of them. And that second contempt hearing, after being warned in the first contempt hearing that he could face fines as high as $150,000 per contempt charge instead of $1,000, That initial contempt hearing had to take place by New York state law so that we could move on with more severe punishment, like the $150,000 per contempt or 30 days in jail. 30 days. Could you imagine? The trial would be postponed, I assume. Well, actually, no, it wouldn't be postponed. Trump would just go to jail, and that would be where he would be able to listen in to his own trial from afar. As a matter of fact, a proffer agreement has already been reached with New York State prison officials and the Secret Service, and apparently the Secret Service is going into prison with Trump, even after he's sentenced to 4 years. Something to think about. The fact that this agreement has already been reached should be a terrifying sign for Donald Trump and his minions. As Peter Navarro, former Trump aide, has attempted to get out of his 5-month prison sentence time and time again, and he's been denied a new trial by judge after judge. Ultimately, I do believe young people care about democracy. They care about fairness. They care about this booming economy which we are living through. They care about these things. Their only interest is not the way the media is framing it in the treatment of Palestinians. That's a small sliver of privileged, very privileged students who go to universities like Berkeley, Harvard, Columbia, and UCLA. They tried this in Texas, by the way, and I do not agree with the way it was handled by the state of Texas at the University of Texas at Austin. Knowing that Austin is an uber liberal city, they came in with force and batons and ran the protesters out. The same thing happened at Emory University in Georgia. These red states don't deal with protests very well because it's usually them who are being protested against. And again, remember that number, 80%. 80% of Americans support Israel. So should President Biden really make the political calculation that 2% is better than 80%? In fact, he was quite emphatic when he came out and was asked if the United States government would divest from Israel, our ally, for more than 75 years. And he gave a blunt answer. One word. No. And I couldn't agree with him more. Back to the Trump Times article and why in the hell he would sit down for a Times article, I have no idea. But the Time magazine, article detailed what a second Trump presidency would look like. Again, everyone would have to pledge allegiance to Trump. That includes bureaucrats that work in the U.S. government. So there would be really no guardrails, nothing to stop Donald Trump from doing whatever Donald Trump wants to do, including the Muslim ban on day one. How does that sound to Palestinian Americans and Arab Americans? They like the idea of a travel ban against their family and friends who might be coming from majority Muslim countries, the way it was back in 2018. And we know that the Supreme Religious Court will uphold anything Donald Trump wants to throw at them. In fact, they're actually waiting now to see what happens in the November election before they decide whether or not to make the president a king by entertaining this absolute immunity nonsense. A second Trump term guarantees the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine, the Palestinians on both sides, will essentially be eradicated. That Bibi Netanyahu will be Prime Minister King of Israel for the rest of his natural life because he's facing 3 criminal trials of his own for corruption as soon as he leaves office. Maybe they'll do it the right way there and just throw him in handcuffs the moment he leaves the Prime Minister's office. That's what we should have done here in the United States. He also said, as far as our allies in Western Europe are concerned, and all of you who hope to one day, take a trip to Paris or Rome or Berlin or London, that he would allow Russia to do, quote, whatever the hell they want to our NATO allies and our EU allies after he essentially gives them Ukraine. These are the consequences of not voting and voting for someone like Defendant J. Trump, Dementia J. Trump. The man clearly is not okay. He's not healthy. We know that he's likely incontinent. We know that he is absolutely out of his mind. We know that vengeance and rage is what fuels the man. We know that he's unstable, that his instability leads us to so many dangerous places. We can't allow that to happen. Get out, vote, 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 and make sure we have a second Biden term, and that is essentially the end of Donald Trump, his grievance, his revenge, and his fascism. And again, I really like that idea of a special counsel to investigate the Supreme Court. I don't know why we don't have one already. Knowing all we know, the deep investigative reporting that's been done on this issue with the Leonard Leos of the world, with the Harlan Crows of the world, and God knows who else, with at least $800,000 in vacations and clothes, with Jenny Thomas leading the January 6th insurrectionists on Telegram. I mean, we know that she was sending out messages telling these people lies that Biden and Obama and others were being held in container ships just off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, where she belongs. Jenny Thomas belongs in Guantanamo Bay. She stoked terrorism on January 6th, 2021. Jenny Thomas, wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who likely wouldn't recuse himself even if his wife was the subject of a trial brought before the Supreme Court. He is corrupt beyond belief. So is Samuel Alito. So is Brett Kavanaugh. And this is what the Roberts Court will be remembered for. It will be remembered for a Chief Justice with no spine, no backbone whatsoever, with no ability to control his own majority, with no ability to do anything other than concede to Samuel Alito. John Roberts, you are a failure. You're a failure who was installed by a president who was not elected but appointed by a conservative Supreme Court. In fact, Professor Alan Lichtman, who has predicted 9 of the last 10 presidential races correctly, insists he got all 10 of them right. It was the state of Florida and Katherine Harris, who was Secretary of State at the time, who decided to throw out 1 in every 10 ballots cast by African Americans in the state of Florida, which broke 95% for Al Gore, and only 1 in 50 ballots of white voters who overwhelmingly voted for W, giving W a very, 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 very small majority. This had nothing to do with hanging chads or any of that nonsense. This was just pure corruption right down to its bones. And that's what we have to worry about with Debbie Powell, even if she manages to get the votes. The same thing, I believe, happened with Andrew Gillum in the 2018 election for governor, when he actually made Ron DeSantis cry during a debate. We're supposed to believe this man beat Andrew Gillum, who was up 5-6 points in the polls leading up to Election Day. And suddenly they had election reporting problems from, guess where? Miami-Dade County, the most liberal part of Florida, where the Democratic base lives, or Miami-Dade. That's where the problems were. And guess who got scapegoated? A black man who was in charge of elections in that part of the state. And finally, we finish today's show with news from Kristi Noem, the woman who shot her poor dog, her 14-month-old puppy Cricket, in the face. And then went on to shoot a goat in the face, probably a donkey, probably a couple of cows. According to her in her book, the dog simply would not learn to hunt. and a dog that's that useless has to be taken off into a gravel pit and shot. Yeah, you heard that right. She shot to death a cute 14-month-old pup who just simply would not take the lessons she was trying to teach, and says this is just the way life on a farm is. Put a pin in that too, because we're going to come back to that in a moment, because you happen to be talking to a farm boy of 35 years. 35 years. So let's remember that for a moment. Her story has since changed several times. Christy has now said that the dog was violent, that it was killing livestock, it was killing chickens, that it was attacking neighbors, and that she didn't actually get the dog. The dog was somebody gave her the dog, and the dog was violent with those people, although she didn't identify who the hell those people might be. Christy Nome, by the way, is still scheduled to be on Meet the Press with Margaret Brennan on CBS Sunday morning. We'll see what kind of story she manages to concoct by then, because apparently the dog even tried to bite her. And by the way, according to her, a 14-month-old full-sized dog is not a puppy. Yes, it is. It is a puppy. This is essentially the pubescent period for dogs. So she knows as much about dogs as she does about running a state. And she's the effing governor of one of 2 Dakotas. We do not need 2 Dakotas. This is just to make sure that there's, more Republican senators in states that don't even have 1 million people. I mean, somehow Washington, D.C. is not a state. Puerto Rico is not a state. But we have 2 effing Dakotas? Why? That makes no sense whatsoever. That's where we get people like Christy Nome and her ever-changing story about shooting her goat, about shooting her poor dog Cricket in a gravel pit. I think it would be suiting that when her life eventually ends, that they bury her in the exact same gravel pit. But at any rate, Christy Nome and the story of murdering her poor dog Cricket. Now, circling back to what I said earlier about being a farm boy myself, 35 years on the farm, almost 30 of those years, we had livestock. We had cattle. And yes, occasionally you have to pop a shot off to scare a dog away or whatever. I'm going to take you back to 1993, East Tennessee, which is never prepared for snow, much less during spring break. I was on spring break from the little elementary school I attended. I was there on the farm where I was raised by my maternal grandparents, when our chickens couldn't get out of the 4 feet of snow that had blanketed East Tennessee over about a 2-day period. Snow just fell like you would not believe. I mean, snow like Buffalo, but in East Tennessee. Of course, this was before the weather change, which most people agreed was sometime around 1996, when global warming finally caught up with us and kind of threw the whole thing out of whack. But I did live 12, 13 years before that violent change in weather that's led to worse wildfires, to more flooding. Anyway, back in 1993, we had free-range chickens, as the area in which I lived was just one farm on top of another. So it was fine to let your chickens wander around. And of course, you'd lose one from time to time to a fox or some other kind of varmint, but that was what it was, an owl, a chicken hawk. The neighbor's dog got loose. He was a Weimaraner. Pretty good-sized dog, probably 100 pounds. And he wiped out what I would say was about 80% of our chickens before we realized what was happening. It had happened mostly overnight. The next morning, we go out and see him with a chicken in his mouth and run him off. We didn't fire a shot at him. We didn't shoot him. We didn't do any of that type of stuff. He ran back to our neighbor's house where he lived, the man who owned him, and he summarily punished the dog. I don't know how, but he certainly didn't shoot him. He just locked him up in a pen and left him there, from what I understand. And he reimbursed my grandfather for the cost of the chickens he had killed. Probably about 20. Now, there were occasions when our dogs that we called farm dogs that mostly slept in the barn or in one of the sheds, but kibble was put out for them each day. Dogs that could be pet and handled, but were no danger to anyone, but just sort of lived on the farm. That's the way it was in the 80s and the 90s. And sometimes their instincts would take over when a calf was born. After all, there's afterbirth, there's a weak mother, and a dog's instincts are much like the instincts of a wolf, right? When they smell that, when they see this helpless animal that's small enough for them to attack, because most of these dogs are roughly 100 pounds. The biggest we ever had was 235 pounds, but he was a shepherd dog and actually defended the little calves when they were born from things like coyotes, which had no chance against a creature this large. It was like having a pet bear. But on occasion, when a neighbor's dog would get too close, would start drooling a little, getting close to these baby calves, I would run inside, grab an old 20-gauge shotgun, a bird gun, one with a long rifle. A long barrel for shooting ducks, geese, whatever. We'd load a bird shot into the chamber, and then about 50 feet, far enough to where no shot at all could accidentally hit the dog, I would shoot the ground, just kick up some mud. The blast from the shotgun and the ground shaking just 50 feet from its tail would send the dog running and squealing in the opposite direction, back home. And it had to do this more than once. But what I did not do is walk down there and shoot that dog in the head. The only time an animal was ever put down on the farm is when it was injured beyond repair. There are stories that I could tell. We'll tell them maybe one of these days on the podcast, but they're gruesome and they're not stories I enjoy remembering, and they were not things that were pleasant to see. But as Kristi Noem's story continues to change around the death of this magnificent creature, because we all know we don't deserve dogs. Dogs are so much better than human beings. The joy they feel in playing, the joy poor Cricket probably had right up until the moment he was walked into a gravel pit and shot in the face by someone he probably trusted. It's grotesque, it's disgusting, and it probably killed her bid to be the vice presidential candidate alongside Donald Trump at this summer's RNC when they make that selection. Kristi Noem, puppy murderer. As if it could get any worse for the MAGA cult, we now have puppy murder. Puppy murder. Think about that for a moment. And while you do, I'll say this. I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. This has been the Magnolia Media Podcast. Check us out on YouTube. I've started posting some daily videos by searching Magnolia Media Network. You'll see me there sitting at my desk, shooting little videos for you guys. We call them Magnolia Minutes, little updates about what's going on in the region, in the state. Please like, subscribe, leave us a comment, smash that notification button. Do the same wherever you're listening to this podcast, and check us out at patreon.com/Magnolia Media Network. That's Magnolia Media Network. Please help keep us on the air. We are a small, tiny organization. We wish we could do a better job. We're doing the best that we can with what we have. And we appreciate each and every one of you who listen to this podcast on a regular basis so very, very much. And once again, my name, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. This has been the Magnolia Media Podcast. Until next time, be well.